Well, the appearance of snow showers yesterday was a reminder too solid to be ignored that summer is really over. I actually thought with regret that I might have chosen the next verse of that hymn that sings about winter. But then I was afraid we might be getting ahead of ourselves, and today has vindicated my judgment. Although fall is my favorite season, and there is no place I'd rather be in the fall than Wisconsin, I have to acknowledge the mixed feelings that I experience at this time of year. The joy of apples and pumpkins and bonfires, but also a certain degree of melancholy. Perhaps it's memories from my childhood about the end of summer vacation, or when I lived in southwestern Michigan, where fall means the next several months spent without ever seeing the sun. This time of year is when I'm most aware of how sensitive we are to the changes around us, and how they also prompt changes inside us. This morning I want to underscore just how significant the ever-changing nature of our world is, and how life-giving and inspiring it can be to pay better attention to the reality of change. To appreciate just how important an idea it is that the world is an ever-changing place, we need to understand how humanity saw the world before we adopted an evolutionary view. One of the courses I teach at the University of Wisconsin is the history of ancient and medieval science. And we learned that the question of a changing world was one of the first challenges that the ancient Greek thinkers faced. When the philosopher Heraclitus said, "You can never step in the same river twice," he was acknowledging the difficulty of knowing a world that never stays the same. The Greeks created a thought problem known as the ship of Theseus to wrestle with this question. If Theseus replaces the old sails on his ship, is it still the same ship? What about if he replaces the hull? What about if he replaces the deck? I thought of renaming that thought problem the Toyota Camry of Scott, because after a certain point I had replaced so much of that car that I wondered if it was in fact the car that I had originally bought. You get the point though, right? How do we say that we know something when it's always in the process of becoming something else? The Greeks feared that their new philosophy might actually be useless if it couldn't give them solid knowledge. This may seem like a silly paradox to struggle over, but I can't emphasize enough how powerfully this question has shaped Western culture, and that we're still wrestling with its repercussions today. The ancient Greeks resolved this intellectual crisis by describing the universe as composed of two worlds: the world of material objects, in which everything changes, and the world of eternal, unchanging ideas and forms. Although most of us don't think much about Greek philosophy these days, this two-world system was also used as a cornerstone of the Christian church. Christian theology was developed as a bridge between Jewish thought and Greek philosophy, drawing ideas from both sources. This is how our culture inherited the idea that humans are composed of a physical, changing body and an eternal, unchanging soul or mind. This is also how we inherited the concept of a transcendent, unchanging God out there, beyond the flawed, decaying material world. For many centuries, Western civilizations had been built around the idea of a perfect, divine being at the heart of all creation, because we want so much to be able to identify at least some part of the universe that does not confuse us by constantly changing. Furthermore, because the church taught that God created the universe as an expression of God's own rational mind, it's not surprising that the arrangement was also perfect and unchanging. scholars depicted this creation as the great chain of being, and it classified all beings in a great family tree in order of their complexity. At the top, God, then angels, humans, other animals in order of complexity, then plants, and finally minerals. An especially important consequence of the chain of being was that although all nature is constantly changing, living, growing, reproducing, and dying, each organism continues to occupy the same place on that ladder. That is, although cats grow, change, and die, they only give birth to other cats and not to, say, daisies or ostriches. Again, this arrangement was an important part of believing that we could really only understand nature if there were essential qualities that remained unchanging. It was the similarity between different kinds of organisms on that chain, though, that prompted the earliest modern questions of evolution. Erasmus Darwin, the infamous grandfather of the famous Charles Darwin, noticed that so many different mammals seem to spend their lives doing all of the same things: moving, consuming, competing, reproducing, and dying. A common thread that could be explained if, many eons ago, they all arose from the same source, from some ancient ancestor. This challenge to the traditional view of perfect, unchanging creation was controversial enough that Erasmus Darwin's book, Zoonomia, was placed on the Catholic Church's list of banned books. Not long after, the French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck suggested that animals could develop characteristics to help them survive, and then they could pass those adaptations on to their offspring. The popular example we use to teach this early theory of evolution is of giraffes stretching their necks to reach the leaves high in the trees, gradually developing longer necks, and then giving birth to offspring that also had slightly longer necks. But of course, it's the work of Charles Darwin that really promoted the idea of evolution with such revolutionary and controversial success. Darwin's insight was that organisms naturally vary, and that the more advantageous variations are passed along more successfully than the less advantageous qualities. For example, not everyone in my family is of the same height. And if being taller were somehow an advantage in producing more offspring, then we could imagine future generations very gradually reflecting this advantage and slowly becoming taller. Of course, since Darwin's painstaking research was conducted before we understood genetics, he didn't know how these characteristics were being passed to the next generation, only that they were. Over enormous spans of time, the very simplest life forms that first populated the Earth diversified and complexified into an entire planet of organisms, very different from our ancient ancestors. Now, no doubt you already know how controversial Darwin's particular explanation of evolution has been. The controversy was not just over what his theory said, but that it was, in fact, a theory. The most common approach to analyzing nature at that time had been simply to make exhaustive lists of observations and hope that some general patterns revealed themselves. What Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, did was to present a hypothesis, that is, an educated guess, that it was a natural process of selection and not a divine creator that had created an entire planet full of diverse life forms from the simplest ancestors. And if you've read his famous book, you know that he presents example after example after example to support this hypothesis. Again, the impact of Darwin's work is not only in what he claimed, but also in how he demonstrated that his claim was true. despite the fearful objections from anti-evolutionists that Darwin's work undermines the religious activities of wonder and reverence, I want to reiterate my original observation of how sensitive we are to the changes in nature, and how this sensitivity also inspires responses in us that we might call religious or spiritual. Other seekers of various kinds have realized that it's not a stretch to take a religious or spiritual view of the evolutionary world. A decade ago, in response to a number of anti-evolution policies passed by the school board in Grantsburg, Wisconsin, a campaign called the Clergy Letter Project was established by biologist Michael Zimmerman and Appleton UCC minister John McFadden. In addition to collecting signatures from clergy and leaders of various faiths in support of evolutionary teachings, this group also sponsors Evolution Weekend each February to encourage dialogue and collaboration between religion and science. Our own movement has an even longer history of trying to make religious sense of the evidence for natural evolution. Unitarians have repeatedly asked themselves about which part of our beliefs are transient, changing from age to age, and which truths are in fact permanent. Unlike almost any other religious movements in the 19th century, Unitarians acknowledged that religious ideas could evolve too, and not be threatened every time a new scientific discovery was made. This is, in fact, the topic of the first chapter of my dissertation, so it's on my mind a lot these days. Later leaders took this conversation even further, stating that evolution could be not only tolerated by religion, but that it could actually strengthen our religious principles. Minneapolis Universalist minister Marion Shutter delivered a series of 12 lectures in 1900 called Applied Evolution, in which he explored the overlap between science and the kind of religion that would be able to respond to the needs of the modern world. To audiences of more than 1,000 attendees each week, he explained the three ways that religion has actually benefited from the contributions of science. First, science quickened the sense of truth in religious thought, awakening it to the real nature and value of truth and the right methods for its discovery. Science has taught theology to look at the facts as they are, and not as it wishes, or hopes, or imagines, or guesses them to be. Second, science has taught theology something about right methods of reasoning. These are not two distinct methods of reaching objective truth. We cannot accept by faith that which contradicts our common sense. Third, science is also delivering theology from the wretched habit of defending doctrine. Science has to do simply with the facts and process of nature. It has no word concerning origin or destiny. We have not lost God. We have only lost an old idea of God's way of doing things. The God of evolution is inside of nature and not outside of it. End quote. As seekers have gotten used to the idea of science being part of our spiritual toolkit, we have the opportunity to push these questions even further. One of the stories I love to tell about the consequence of our questions is about a fisherman who pulled his catch in from the sea using a net with a 3-inch mesh and concluded that the waters contained no fish smaller than 3 inches. The lenses we look through determine what we are able to see. Some modern philosophers have concluded that the evolutionary view is so basic to how the world operates that we even need to rethink our most basic religious questions. Charles Hartshorne, for example, introduced a system of thought he called process theology, in which the very foundation of all reality, whether we call it God, Natural law, the ground of all being, is not separate from the flow of time, but is also affected by the events of history and is evolving in response. Hartshorne argued that conventional Christian theology depended too much on ancient Greek thought and on the idea of worshiping something permanent beyond our ever-changing world. This early mistake left the church with several fundamental misunderstandings that continue to haunt Christianity even today. The errors that Hartshorne identifies include the teaching that God must be perfect and therefore must be unchangeable. That God is omnipotent, meaning that everything that happens was meant to happen. That God is omniscient, meaning that God can never gain new knowledge, and that whatever freedom of decision we humans have cannot contribute to God's experience. That God's goodness does not involve sympathy. Some have compared this to the sun's way of doing good by supporting life on earth, but not being changed by that action. A very odd description of goodness. And lastly, the teaching that some individuals have gained such clear and trustworthy revelation about religion that we cannot question or update their claims about God. This exploration has been a little heavier on the God talk than I'm used to. And I know that this traditional language makes some of us a little squirmy. But I wanted to make the point of just how deeply evolutionary thought is pushing its revolution into the heart of religion as well as science. That is, in some circles, there is no longer any exception or limit to the reach of evolution. Every corner of our lives and every corner of our minds and thought are now subject to the principles that life is always, always changing. Rather than religion being a collection of claims that disagree with our own experiences and yet cannot ever be questioned, I'm recognizing how powerful it is when our beliefs about creation are completely compatible with our beliefs about everything else that we experience. I see this agreement in the various spiritualities I already hear developed by people sitting in this room, woven out of doubts and questions and guesses and dreams, all made to respond to a world that refuses to sit still so that we can nail it down. What a difference it makes not having to accommodate our experiences to a religion that denies the realities of our lives. As Carl Zimmer wrote in our reading this morning, no scientific discovery has upset the comforts and certainties from our past as thoroughly as Darwin's. No other intellectual revolution has so thoroughly revealed the weakness at the heart of how religion has traditionally been practiced. Even though it might be human nature to want to ignore that the world around us and within us is constantly changing, we have so much to gain by embracing science and spirituality that acknowledges evolution as a basic truth. I think of this service as just the beginning of a longer conversation about what is possible for religion and spirituality. And as always, I look forward to adding your questions and comments to this dialogue because our story is still being written.